Online discourse around 1348 Ex Voto has been unusually loud for a small indie medieval game. Much of the conversation hasn't focused on gameplay systems or level design. A lot of the attention comes from the protagonist being a lesbian knight and the game getting pulled into broader internet arguments about representation in historical settings. The situation escalated further when people online began comparing the game to another medieval indie project called Knight's Path. After the developers of that game made comments about avoiding modern agendas, the developers of 1348 responded online, and the exchange quickly turned into a broader internet debate. At that point, the conversation around 1348 had very little to do with how the game actually plays. Personally, I don't approach games looking for political signaling either way. I'm mostly interested in whether the game itself holds up. After seeing all the noise around 1348, I decided to pick it up and see what's actually here. The game also features voice work from Jennifer English. I've always liked her voice, so that definitely got my attention. The real question for me was simple. Once you set the controversy aside, what kind of game is this actually trying to be? In this review, I'm going to look at how the combat works, how progression and upgrades are handled, how the presentation holds together, and whether the overall experience is worth your time. In 1348 Ex Voto, you play as Ayeta, a young knight errant searching for her captured lover Bianca during a period of pillaging and conflict. Her search takes her through forests, villages, and ruined settlements as she tries to track where the prisoners are being taken. The setup is simple at first, though later parts of the story introduce developments that may leave you wondering why certain things happen the way they do. I'll come back to that later. For now, let's talk about what is probably the best part of the game, the combat. The developers place a strong emphasis on the combat system. Sword fighting is presented in a cinematic style inspired by historical European martial arts, with animations performed through motion capture by trained actors. Combat revolves around guarding, dodging, and switching between one-handed and two-handed stances. You have a light and heavy attack that triggers when you hold the attack button. Most fights in 1348 revolve around one goal, breaking the enemy's guard. The center of the system is the guard bar, which both you and your enemies have. Guarding allows you to block incoming attacks, but repeated hits will drain the bar. When a guard bar breaks, that character staggers and becomes briefly unable to defend. Because of this, many encounters revolve around creating an opening to break an enemy's guard. Once their guard is broken, your attacks cannot be blocked for a short moment. Timing also matters during combos. If you strike with the correct rhythm, you trigger a perfect strike which deals more damage and applies stronger pressure on an enemy's guard. Enemy weapon types change how you approach fights. Enemies using daggers attack quickly and require patience, while enemies carrying longer weapons swing slowly but hit harder if you mistime a dodge. Some enemy attacks glow before they land. These attacks cannot be blocked and must be avoided with a dodge. Another factor to keep in mind is recovery time. The final hit of your combo has a longer animation which can leave you open if you commit at the wrong moment, especially when fighting multiple opponents. Later in the skill tree, you can unlock a parry ability. The animation is short and responsive, and it can even cancel your own attack animations. Parrying also works against those unblockable attacks, which makes the ability extremely strong once it becomes available. Combat ends up carrying much of the experience in this game. What becomes more noticeable is how everything between those fights is structured. Health is measured through a simple heart system. You begin with 5 hearts, and each hit removes 1. Food scattered around the environment restore a single heart when used. Exploration rewards you with several types of collectibles. Papers function as the game's upgrade currency and are used to unlock skills. The game features 4 skill trees, although you begin with 2 and unlock the others later in the story. You can also collect pieces of swords which modify your longsword. These parts allow you to lean further into either one-handed or two-handed combat styles. Trinkets provide bonuses. There are a number of trinkets you can pick up in the game. One sample trinket can increase the chance of receiving additional food from pickups, while another trinket provides emergency effects such as preventing death by consuming all the food that you are carrying. Only a limited number of trinkets can be active at once. The game autosaves frequently, especially before fights. When you die, you respawn fully recovered, which reduces the incentive to invest heavily into health or guard upgrades. In practice, most upgrade currency ends up going toward improving combat abilities. The environments can look quite beautiful at times. Forest paths, ruined settlements, and medieval structures often create attractive scenery. At the same time, the world can feel very empty. Outside of enemy encounters, there are very few characters present in these locations. Character models look decent but not exceptional. One area that stands out is the facial animation during cutscenes, where expressions come through clearly during dialogues. Voice acting is strong considering how small the cast is. Jennifer English voices Bianca and delivers a memorable performance. Albie Baldwin voices Ayeta and does an excellent job, which matters since you spend the entire game listening to her. Combat animations can feel slightly sluggish. Sword strikes somewhat lack impact, which makes certain attacks feel a bit floaty. Even so, the combat system remains easy to adapt to once you understand the rhythm of the fights. The game follows a very linear structure. Most of the time, you will encounter areas that slightly deviate from the main route, and these places usually give you food and rarely weapon parts, trinkets, and treasure. Most of the experience follows a consistent loop. You move through an area, fight a group of enemies, listen to Aita comment on her surroundings, and then continue toward the next encounter. Large portions of the game are spent simply walking between these fights. The environments can look nice, but they often feel empty, with little happening outside of combat encounters. My playthrough lasted about 5 hours from start to finish, and some of that runtime comes from these travel sections between battles. If the structure is this straightforward, does the story manage to carry the rest of the experience? The narrative begins with a clear objective. Ayeta is searching for her captured lover Bianca. The early chapters establish that goal clearly, but as the story progresses, the writing begins to move in directions that feel increasingly strange. Certain decisions made by the characters create situations where you may start asking why events are unfolding the way they are. Moments arise where a more direct solution seems possible, yet the story continues extending the conflict. As the game approaches its later chapters, new revelations reshape the situation entirely. These developments attempt to build toward a dramatic confrontation, though the reasoning behind them may leave some players puzzled about how the story even arrived there. Without getting into spoilers, the final stretch pushes the narrative into territory that feels much more unusual than the initial premise suggests. Several technical and design problems appeared during my playthrough. There were occasional frame drops, particularly in the early game. Some interactions feel slower than they need to be, particularly when moving objects during puzzle sections. And there's a lot of it in this game. The game frequently asks you to crouch through tight spaces or press a button to drop down from ledges. These sequences appear often enough that they begin to feel unnecessary. Enemy encounters can also behave unpredictably at times. In some fights, additional enemies spawn behind you in the middle of combat. I also encountered a few progression issues. At one point, I became stuck in terrain and couldn't move, and in another instance, I was trapped in a room because an enemy could not be located. Another small detail is that Ayeta never opens doors. Movement through areas usually involves climbing or dropping down instead. The scope of the project is clearly limited, which makes sense for a small development team. The combat system ends up doing most of the heavy lifting. Breaking enemy guards, switching stances, and managing timing during fights keeps encounters engaging throughout the campaign. At the same time, the structure around those fights feel less consistent. Long stretches of walking through quiet areas slow the pacing, and the game likely could have been a 3-hour experience if those sections were tighter. The story also eventually moves in directions that may leave players questioning some of the decisions behind it. Even with those issues, there is still an enjoyable combat system at the center of the experience. 1348 Ex Ex Voto ends up feeling like a modest indie action game. There are elements here that work well, particularly the combat and voice performances, but the other parts of the game struggle to reach the same level. Once you set the controversy aside, what you're left with is a small action game with a solid combat system at its core, even if some parts of the game feel less developed. If you'd like to check the game out, the link is in the description. If you played 1348 Ex Voto, let us know what you think. And if you enjoyed the video, consider leaving a like, subscribing to the channel, and sticking around for more. I'll see you in the next one.